Good afternoon, everyone. We shall be starting shortly. Good afternoon. We'll be starting shortly. All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Region 2 Grant Writing Tips for Art Grants. This is Ignacio, the Director for Programs for the Center for Creative Land Recycling. Today, I am pleased to be joined by four panelists who have worked on the EPA Brownfields program for many years. And before I begin, I want to be sure that people sign up for the Brownfields 2019 conference in Los Angeles. After this is all done, we can all have a good time there and kind of debrief on how it went. So, Claire, do I have control? There. All right, thank you. Today, during this webinar, the speakers will provide varying perspectives on how to prepare competitive brownfield grant applications. Our first speaker is Jeanine Mitchell with the EPA Region 2 Brownfields team. She will be followed by Kaitlin Wright of the Syracuse Land Bank, then Mike Storonsky and Chris Jadak with Stantec Consulting will provide the consultant's view of how to make grants successful. We will go through all the presentations, and while this is going on, please type any questions on the console on the right side of your screen, and we will get to as many questions as possible after everyone has given their presentations. These slides, as well as a recording of the webinar, will be available a day after the webinar. There will also be a short survey, and we appreciate your feedback. Before I continue, a little bit about SeeClear, if you're not familiar with us. SeeClear is a national organization that provides technical assistance to communities seeking to reuse previously used lands into sustainable uses. We do this through technical assistance, workshops, webinars, and consulting. In Region 2, which is comprised of New Jersey, New York, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, SeeClear staff are Jean Hammerman and Claire Weston. We have a great team out there, so please tap into them. They facilitate a lot of activities in Region 2, and they're having a blast out there. We also cover Regions 9 and 10 out in the West. We also have several partners that help us implement our programs. Now, over the past 5 years, SeeClear has reviewed dozens of applications from Region 2 and hundreds nationally. We are uniquely positioned to provide feedback on what has worked and what hasn't in these grant applications. Before proceeding, we'd like to know a little bit more about you, the audience calling in. So we have a few polling questions, And please, I will read, post the poll. Please answer. You have about 5 or 10 seconds and we'll post the response. Where are you located? All right, so mostly from New York, actually more from Puerto Rico than New Jersey, and a few people from outside the area. Great. Next question. Go. Uh, are you a municipality, nonprofit, county, land bank, or other? All right, I'm going to be closing now. Lots of nonprofits. A quarter of you are nonprofits. I would assume there are some consultants out there, municipalities and counties. And as you know, nonprofits have increased eligibility. So we're glad to see you joining the webinar. Next question. Have you applied for an EPA grant at any time in the past? All right, I'm going to be closing soon. Oh, almost 50% here. And I see if I have one more. Okay, last question for this. Have you, for those who have, well, actually for anyone, so including those who haven't applied, have you won an EPA grant of any kind? So 2/3 have not and 1/3 have. So thank you for your feedback. We will go back to our presentation. So the next speaker will be Jeanine. And so Jeanine, take it over. Jeanine, as I said, is with the Region 2 Brownfields team, and she will provide some feedback based on the recent debrief comments from recently submitted grant applications from Region 2. So Jeanine?
Thank you, Ignacio, and good afternoon to everyone. So to help you with the FY 2020 competition, the EPA Region 2 Brownfield team conducted an analysis of the debriefings they did for 27 regional proposals submitted for the FY 19 EPA Brownfields competition. The reviewer comments were analyzed and we looked for the common weaknesses. So today I'll be highlighting reviewer comments from 3 categories: project area description and plans for revitalization, community need and community engagement, task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress. So we'll start off with project area description and plans for revitalization. We noticed that proposals were failing to provide good social, economic, and cultural details on the targeted area and how this impacts those locations. Some proposals lack essential information like increasing property taxes and decreasing job revenues, which would help to address the economic needs for that particular community. Some fail to identify priority sites for the community. Key details such as types of contaminants, any redevelopment plans, and in some cases, a number of brownfields in these targeted locations were missing, which is critical to understand the needs for those particular projects. Another weakness was not addressing poverty, employment, and crime rates with supporting facts. We also noticed that reviewers mentioned forgetting citations or references to support community need, which is also very critical. Some of the other weaknesses that we noticed were proposals failed to address housing, poverty, and unemployment rates. Additional details such as quantity of jobs, housing statistics, or figures that support potential impacts would make these types of sections stronger. Redevelopment strategies and economic benefits are described vaguely, as well as the specific benefits to redevelopment and tax revenue projections. In addition, we found some other common mistakes that include not addressing the cleanup resources, nor funding for assessments and cleanups. The potential sources of funding, or a list of them, could be used in each phase of the project is not addressed appropriately. Then we also noticed that some proposals lack detail in their description of existing infrastructure and the relevance to the project, the potential reuse, and the recycling of infrastructure on site. We also noticed that proposals also lack the ability to show a link to the demographics, including sensitive populations, and how the community will benefit from these proposed assessments. So the final comments that we had for the project area description and plans for revitalization is that reviewers noticed that proposals were failing to provide specific health and welfare issues related to sensitive populations in the community, and how the grant and the reduction of brownfields will address threats to sensitive populations. And finally, we noticed that applicants missed using health studies and or references to identify the adverse health conditions in the targeted areas. So now we're going to move on to community need and community engagement. And in this section is where we found the least amount of weaknesses, but there were weaknesses to begin with. So in particular, what was emphasized was the roles for some of the community organizations were too ambiguous. The section could be stronger if more details about the actual role the communities would play as partners in their projects were identified. We also noticed that mechanisms for collecting data and feedback from the community are not very clear. Specific dates for meetings and reaching out to the communities lacked detail. More information is needed on how communities can respond in a meaningful way and where residents can access project information. So now we're going to move on to the final section. Oops.
Jeanine, we lost you.
Yeah, I can't advance my slide for some reason. Hold on one second. Let me just. All right, so I'm going to keep talking without moving the slide. Some of the weaknesses that we saw in the third section, which is the task descriptions, cost estimates, and measuring progress, include some of the proposals failed to describe technical expertise and understanding the full scope of the assessment projects. We also noticed that some of the activities described should be completed by the grantee and not the engineering contractor. Although the timing of activities and the commitment to complete all tasks within 3 years are addressed, in some cases the activities appear to be unachievable. The costs provided in the budget are not explained or broken down in detail. We also noticed not enough details are provided on cost development, such as providing units, detailed cost per staff, are not provided in very minimal detail, or are not provided or provided in very minimal detail. And then distinctions are not made between hazardous and petroleum activities, nor the distinction between phase 1 and phase 2 activities. Project costs lack correlation with the proposed tasks. And then finally, under the task descriptions and cost estimates, failing to provide schedules, timelines, and task descriptions. The specific outputs are not discussed in detail, and how these outputs would lead to project success and completion. and then lacking in detail on evaluating project progress, schedules, and how progress will be tracked and measured. And then finally, no discussion about potential corrective actions, and sometimes the outputs and outcomes are not clearly listed. So what's next? For EPA Region 2, we're making a great effort to conduct several outreach and guideline workshops within the region. As you'll note on the slide, we have 2 outreach meetings in New Jersey, and then we have 3 taking place in New York. So please feel free to come out and participate in those workshops. We'll also be having some dates in Puerto Rico as well, and the Virgin Islands. So we really want to give our regional applicants a heads up. So we'll no longer be requesting a request for proposals. We'll be requesting applications. So this is critical because the forms that you see noted in the presentation are required under the announcement. So everything that's listed from 1 to 7 has to be included in your application, or your application will not be considered. As a matter of fact, when you go to submit your application online in grants.gov, if you don't have all several forms, you can't move forward. You won't be able to submit your application. So if you have any questions about any of the documents and how to fill them out, we'll be providing that information during our workshop. And we also recommend that you reach out to headquarters to find out about their webinar, which I believe is taking place on October 24th. And so we'll be here as a team to help you with any of your questions that you may have about putting together your application. And that's it for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jeanine. This is Ignacio again, and I will now provide SeeClear's feedback on and tips for the grants we have been reviewing. And since the grant guidelines recently came out, Jeanine, Stantec, and SeeClear quickly reviewed the application, the guidelines, and put these presentations together, but we did not coordinate our comments so much, and I think that's actually helpful because people see all the comments independently and can, together they might reinforce. We actually reinforce each other's comments. So yeah, okay. So first about trends. So this table gives the funding that EPA has given the Brownfields ARC program since 2014. And you can see that it varies between the mid 50 millions to the mid 60 millions. And you see this really, it went down for the next fiscal year, but this is common practice for EPA staff to underestimate what they can provide in grants. Last year, they actually anticipated providing 49 million or so in grants, and somehow they find the money. And keep in mind that the federal budget has not been approved. So we expect that the 48 million would be the way bottom, and we expect it to be pretty similar to what the range you find in front of you now. Now, these numbers, the applicants do not include those that did not pass threshold. So there are actually more communities that apply for these grants, but several of them do not make it to this table because they do not pass threshold. And I will address that in the next slide, next few slides. So why is SeeClear giving this presentation? SeeClear is a technical assistance to brownfields or TAB provider for EPA Regions 2, 9, and 10. We provide free peer review of grant applications regardless of who writes them. Over the past several years, the batting average of applications nationally has been roughly 1 in 3, and that's been pretty consistent. SeeClear review batting averages far outpace the national statistics, and we have been increasingly improving our reviews. So our batting average last year was about 60%, and for those that we worked with closely, it's closer to 73%. And I'll explain what kind of review that entails. As far as Region 2, we would like to work with communities to improve the statistics because last year it was 18%, and SeeClear's average was 40% last year. So it's not great, still above the national average, but we'd like to see that improve. Of note also, we cannot write the grant for you, but we will review it as often as we have time to review grants and subject to our capacity. So the lessons I will describe kind of follow what Jeanine's outlined. And it will also help us review your proposals if you come in with a more polished grant application. So while we will review early drafts, we really prefer reviewing applications that are 75%, so we can really focus in on the content rather than work with editing and other items that should really be taken care of in-house. Our main concern is people do not start early enough. You should really have started last month. There will be an EPA webinar on Thursday, the 24th at 2 p.m. Eastern, and the tab providers will also have their own webinar on the 30th, Wednesday the 30th at 2 p.m. But don't wait for these webinars to start your drafts. That would be a mistake. Again, Jeanine did not touch on threshold so much. However, these are things that you should get on immediately, particularly if you have a cleanup or a site-specific assessment grant application. If you're thinking about a coalition, especially if they are nonprofits, start looking at eligibility to ensure that your coalition partners are eligible entities. If it's a site, make sure, check with EPA that it is an eligible site, and site eligibility and threshold are those types of questions you can ask EPA without them being concerned about giving you ranking criteria advice. As Jeanine mentioned, work on your SAM and your DUNS. Find the person who has these and make sure that they're available when it's time to upload your grant. The forms that Jeanine listed, these are really standard forms that most communities can just fill out as staff, but some communities actually require that these types of forms be reviewed by legislative body. So be sure that you get to these forms right away. You can answer these without going through your grant application or through the guidelines, and get them done. And also get any letters you need from council or board approval, particularly for coalitions. These might take time. Now I'll go through the narrative comments in the same order that Jeanine had them. Now, so when people look at the grant applications, the grant guidelines, they start answering questions. For some, this works. For some, this is a mistake. You should think about the program, what you're trying to do in your community, and how site assessments and cleanup planning and community participation will work toward that goal. If you start filling out those questions, you might lose sight of what you're trying to do in the big picture. That includes big picture of cost, the resources you have, the team you have to work with, and you're thinking through and how you get this done. It's really what, how, when, and why. Think of those questions as you're going through these through your program, and most likely you will respond to all the questions that the guidelines ask for. Think about your resources, what you can do in-house and what you will need to contract for. Think about your in-house team and how you will coordinate, and your consultant and partners. And lastly, and this is more of a competitive advice, plan for more than 50% of your budget to phase ones and phase twos, because that's an EPA, it's not a requirement, but it's a competitiveness measure. New this year, essentially the guidelines did not change much, but the way they tweaked it really gives you an insight to what the guidelines are looking for. There are many tweaks that seem benign, but have a philosophical effect on how your grant is written. In past years, initiatives and concepts like environmental justice, climate change, and sustainability were written into proposals, with applicants hoping that dropping these terms would automatically receive those points. That's no longer a good strategy. You will need to explain how your community plans incorporate such concepts and how your work plan integrates those into reuse to earn the full points. Projects in opportunity zones can earn up to a maximum of 5% more than those that are not in opportunity zones. But again, you will need to explain how your work plan and the reuse will take advantage of the opportunity zone. Just don't name drop partners either. You need to demonstrate the role and how you will communicate with them effectively, especially for coalitions. The work plan descriptions have been subdivided into more detailed criteria so you do not miss these don't miss these answers. So they actually are helping, providing more clarity into what EPA wants you to think about and answer. But this means that the application will need to outline every step and explain all these things, including cost calculations, and this uses a lot of space. EPA is allowing responses to 2 or more criteria to be combined, and this is new. Usually it's 1 response per criteria, and now they're allowing combined responses. If you do this, make sure that you point out in your application that your response below is responding to several criteria, so you do not miss those points. As you are thinking of your drafts, decide now if staff is writing it, if you're hiring an editor, a grant writer, and if the latter, what type of consultant. There are many consultants that can help. If you want to use the same consultant to write the grant and implement the program, you will need to follow procurement procedures. And given that there is a minimum time in advertising these, and we have basically 7 weeks to the deadline, you're really running out of time. So you have to decide basically this week. Lastly, if you have had EPA brownfields grants in the past, be sure your acres reporting is current and accurate. If your grant forms, and if you're an older grantee and they came before acres, which would be in the mid 2000s, be sure you have your property profile forms as well and review those. You might have to go back to your previous consultant. Hopefully you have your records or they are willing to share those records with you. Leveraging is again another key guideline where many points are determined. Many people get maximum and others don't. You can demonstrate that you're planning ahead by describing how you will leverage a variety of federal and state programs, and demonstrate that you've used them in the past and or have current relationships. Again, opportunity zones are key, and it's important to touch base with regional or state organizations that are working with local governments to facilitate the delivery of technical assistance and investments to your community. If you're working with opportunity funds or aligning local programs to be consistent with opportunity zone investments, mention those. Quantify any local financial or in-kind leveraging as well. And I'm sure Jeanine will appreciate the editing, writing, and actually SeeClear will appreciate this too. Since we review basically, well, EPA grant probably goes through 2 dozens of this, and SeeClear reviews about 75 of these a year. We'd appreciate if the writing and editing are really top-notch. Make them readable. Use every page. What does not, but that doesn't mean using every square millimeter. Reviewers go through, again, many of these, and having a distinctive, unique look helps. The variety does help the EPA reviewer. Active and upbeat focus tone is highly recommended. Get to your point right away. Answer the response. Don't back end your responses, because an EPA reviewer will look for the response, and if they have to look at the end of your response to find the answer to what they're looking for, they might not give you full points. Usually they're kind and they will give you those, but don't chance it. Answer the response right away. So don't waste your time on backgrounds or pleasantries before starting to write what really is an urgent matter or concern to your community. If you can, use subheadings to make sure the reader can connect the dots, and use format and topic sentences, active verbs, positive tone, and spin. And of course, data, numbers, and quantify. Use the relevant numbers. Don't toss a whole bunch of numbers that don't mean anything. Use numbers that get to your point. As for SeeClear reviews, please let us know if you are sending us, plan to send us a review. Thanksgiving is November 28th, and if you send it to us after November 28th, I'm sorry, I'm making Thanksgiving dinner, so you might not get a full review. So that's my presentation, and I have a couple more polling questions here. So let's see if I can get them here. Okay, this is going back to those who received awards. So only those that received awards, if you were selected, what was your most recent award? Mostly assessment. Oh, we have a revolving loan fund. All right, interesting. And our last polling question. And the proposal was written by a staff consultant at no cost, consultant with cost, partner nonprofit, or other. Mostly staff, and a lot of kind-hearted consultants there. So thank you very much. That gives you a good idea of who else out is in the audience. And now our next speaker will be Kaitlin. Kaitlin is with the Syracuse Land Bank, a recent awardee of I think a a community-wide assessment. So Kaitlin.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me, I hope?
Yes.
Wonderful. I'm with the Greater Syracuse Land Bank. Land banks, for those of you who don't know, at least in New York State, we are considered local public authorities, so we're a quasi-governmental entity. Our land bank was established by the city and the county, and our job is to acquire vacant and abandoned properties, stabilize them, and facilitate their return to productive use. We primarily do this by acquiring tax foreclosures that the city or the county has foreclosed on, and many of their tax delinquent properties are brownfields. We have historically avoided getting involved with brownfield properties, primarily due to lack of information and all of the unknowns with these properties, not knowing how much cleanup is required. So our impetus for applying for a brownfield assessment grant was that we wanted to answer some of those questions and eliminate some of those unknowns so that we could not just get homes redeveloped, but also other potential brownfield properties as well. We first applied for an assessment grant in 2016 with our staff writing it, and we were unsuccessful in that first year. We had a good debriefing session with the EPA and got a lot of feedback from them on what we could do to improve. But we're a relatively small shop, and we knew that it was going to take a lot of time and a lot of studying for us to improve our application. And so we decided that we needed to bring in some outside assistance. So we decided to issue an RFQ, or request for qualifications, to bring in some consultants to help us write our 2017 application. We reached out to CCLR actually for a list of potential consultants that do this kind of work. We had a handful of firms here locally that we've worked with in the past on environmental issues, but we wanted to cast a wider net than just our local consulting pool. And so CCLR was very helpful in providing us with a list of vendors that we should include on the distribution list to get the RFQ. And we were also able to get some copies of RFQs that other communities have issued in the past to base ours on, so we didn't have to reinvent the wheel. Like I said, we are a public authority, so we're quasi-governmental. Our procurement guidelines give us a little bit more flexibility than if we were a municipality. Thank goodness that enabled us to move a little bit more quickly. So when we issued the RFQ, Stantec was one of the consultants that responded, and they were the only one of our pool of respondents that said they would prepare the application at no cost to us. And so our board of directors, taking into consideration their fee structure and also their past success rate, decided that we would contract with them to draft the application. Their proposal was that they would prepare the application at no cost to us, and if we were awarded, then they would administer the grant. So in 2017, we were not successful either, but we were able to get, again, a lot of helpful feedback from the EPA. And in 2018, continuing to work with Stantec, we were successful in being awarded an assessment grant. As far as drafting the application goes, just because we were outsourcing it doesn't mean that there was no work to be done on our part. Obviously, we have the local knowledge of where are the brownfield sites and which ones would we want to prioritize for assessment. And we're also very fortunate that we were working as a coalition. And because our land bank is established by the city and the county, we have a close working relationship with them. Their economic development staff already have pretty good knowledge of where these brownfield sites are and which ones are best suited for economic development. So we were able to draw on them for a lot of their existing inventory information, and then work with Stantec to see which of those sites aligned with existing plans from previous brownfield opportunity area plans, the city's comp plan, and other neighborhood revitalization plans. So it was definitely a team effort, and I would say to keep in mind that even if you are outsourcing it, it's not going to be entirely taking it off of your plate. They're going to need a great deal of information from you. And with that, I will turn it over to our partners at Stantec.
Thank you, Mike. Are you available?
Yep.
Oh.
Hello, this is Mike Stronsky. I'm located in Rochester, New York, just down the thruway from Kaitlin in the city of Syracuse. And I specialize in brownfields within New York State.
And I'm Chris Jadak. I help lead Stantec's National Brownfield Grant Program.
Whoops. A little too fast. Sorry about that. So Stantec is a global consulting firm. For those of you who don't know us, we have more than 22,000 staff in 400 offices across the globe. Since 2011, we've assisted more than 70 communities across 9 EPA regions to secure or implement more than $40 million of EPA brownfield grants. Our recent success in New York State includes preparing applications for the city of Rochester in 2018 for a cleanup grant. And as Kaitlin has outlined, in 2019, we assisted them in getting the largest coalition grant in Region 2 since 2013. And across the entire country in 2019, we assisted our clients in obtaining $7.7 million of grants from EPA through the competition. And this map depicts the locations of our prior grant experience across the U.S. So as Kaitlin outlined, we had recommended to the land bank to form a coalition to strengthen the chances for getting a grant, having previously applied unsuccessfully, as well as the county having applied unsuccessfully. And Syracuse is located in Onondaga County, for those who don't know the geography. So they procured our services, and as she noted, we were successful this past year here. So I wanted to break down some of the responsibilities that Kaitlin alluded to here. The coalition is formed by 3 members, the county and the city industrial development agencies and the land bank as the lead applicant. So as the lead applicant, Kaitlin's organization is charged with procuring a consultant in this case. They're also responsible for coordinating the activities with the coalition members and the community stakeholders, solicit their input. As Kaitlin noted, they had a lot of background information regarding sites and concerns within the community that they were able to provide to us. And they arranged at their offices a community outreach event to solicit input regarding the application. And then they ultimately are the ones to submit the application to EPA. As a consultant, there's quite a bit of research, content preparation that's involved in municipalities or communities where there is not a good existing inventory of brownfield sites. That's often a task that we perform. And then we guide the grantee through the application process and the ultimate submittal of that document to EPA. In this case, the city and county IDAs, as coalition members, were asked to provide information about their priority sites and areas that they wished to focus on with the grant. They are obligated to provide a letter of commitment and also to execute a memorandum of agreement. We estimate that typically this combined effort between all the parties is on the order of maybe 220 hours to prepare a successful application. Around 150 hours for a consultant's efforts, about 50 hours for the lead grantee, and 20 hours split between the 2 coalition members, 10 hours each for their contributions. And with that, we'll turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Mike. And this is a good time to remind everybody, if you've got any questions, there's a messenger window where you can submit them via text message. And otherwise, we'll, I think, take verbal questions at the end of the presentation. I'm a statistics guy. So on the left-hand side of this slide, there's a bunch of statistics that Stantec gathered through FOIA requests. We Every time the grant announcements come out in the spring, we request information on who applied for what type of grant and how much in each of the 10 EPA regions. For those of you who aren't statistics people, there's a summary of our key takeaways on the right-hand side of the slide. In Region 2, for the 2019 grant competition, there were actually 27 applications, but 3 of them did not pass the threshold criteria and didn't receive a formal score. Of the 24 applications that did pass the threshold criteria, only 5 of them were funded. There was $1.6 million of multi-purpose grants awarded, 2 of them $800,000 each in New Jersey. And then there's $1.2 million in the region awarded of assessment grants. 2 of those were in New York State and 1 in Puerto Rico. There were no cleanup grant applications awarded in Region 2 in 2019. So overall, 5 out of 24 was 21%. Comparing Region 2 to the national average, you can see below at the bottom of the slide on the left. As Ignacio pointed out earlier, the national average was approximately 1/3 of applications were funded, or 33%. Comparing Region 2 to your neighbors in New England, there's comparatively less competition in Region 2. You can see that there were 70 applications in Region 1 this year versus 24 in Region 2. And then the Mid-Atlantic region as well, there were 33 applications versus 24 in Region 2. Some of the staggering statistics are, you can see that 44% of the 70 applications in New England were funded in 2019, and 73%, or over 3 times the success rate in Region 3 versus Region 2 this year. Some of the reasons we believe this is happening is other regions have more established programs, and that they're likely sharing information and best practices about how to write successful applications and using the past successes of other winning applications to further other applications in the region. Has somebody passed the control over to me? Can somebody advance to the next slide if they've got control? There we go. So we pulled FOIA requests of applications in New York, specifically for 2019, and there's some obvious traits with top scoring proposals. The first one is that they make full use of the allowed pages. So this year for assessment and cleanup grants, you're allowed 10 pages of narrative and 12 pages for RLFs. When we open up an application through a FOIA request and we see that there's only 8 out of 10 pages used, or large spaces between sections or tables, it's pretty obvious to us that you can't have that type of space in the application and still meet all of the criteria. Another trait is that top winning applications pay strict adherence to the space to point ratios for each section. This year for assessment grants, there's 180 points available and only 10 pages of narrative. So on every page, you have to have content. If you're going to pay adherence to the ratio, you need on one page sections that add up to 18 points. If you have one section on a page and it's only worth 5 points, it's very difficult to make up and meet the criteria in any of the other given sections. Another trait of top scoring proposals is that there are no glaring omissions. Basically, there's no sections missed, there's no major criteria missed. That's an obvious way to lose 5 points. Some of the key differentiators between high scoring applications and applications that are funded is that you've got compelling story elements, be it distress factors, specific sites, redevelopment plans. You're trying to impress upon the reader why you deserve funding over another community, and that community could be Cleveland or Detroit. They could have very compelling demographics, and so you need to weave in to your story compelling items that are going to resonate with the reviewer and make an impression. Next slide. Conversely, lower scoring proposals don't make use of the full pages, have space to point ratios that are out of whack, don't address, new criteria, don't review the guidelines for 2020 and see how they're different from 2019, but stick to a past format. And one of the things we've noticed actually, which is good news for smaller communities, is that programmatic capability is typically not a differentiator. All the applications in New York, for example, whether they're funded or not, receive full points for programmatic capability in 2019. Last slide. So here are our top 5 tips for writing a compelling application. Number 1 is reviewing the guidelines and scoring criteria in detail and attending webinars. And if you're listening to me right now, you've done at least half of that. Review winning grant applications. Get a hold of some past applications that have been successful. Don't reinvent the wheel. Look at those applications and copy the format and make it unique to your community. Don't deviate significantly from the points of space ratios is something that I mentioned on both the previous slides, but it's critically important. Don't take a whole page to do a 5-point section. Look at the weighting and try and adhere somewhat to the points per space ratios of each subsection. I'll get started, and early incorporation of SeeClear into the process. Ignacio and his team have incredible success rates in working with communities, and we suggest you work with them. And finally, craft a compelling story. Really focus on what makes you unique to set you apart from the competition. Create good flow and consistency between sections, and that's usually done through working with a consultant, an experienced grant writer, or a technical editor. Last slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Jeanine and Kaitlin, and Mike for your advice. I think this is probably the first webinar of the EPA grant season, and we really scheduled it early because we want you to start early. This year, they only provided 50-something days, shorter than the customary 60-plus days for a grant application. And with the holidays and with Brownfields 2019 on the horizon, there's much less time. So hopefully this lights a fire under all of you to get your grants done early and look for a consultant if the crunch will not work for you. Now I have a question here about Tab EZ. Now, Kansas State University, one of our TAB partners, does have a website, and Chris mentioned this, that you can access previously successful grant applications. I believe the applications from last year are already posted. Download these and look them over and see how they're formatted, how they're written. There are really very well written grant applications there. And Chris said you might copy them. That works for some people and it doesn't for others. But do go over them with recognizing that the grant criteria has changed a bit and you would have to tweak it to be current. The other thing that Tab EZ has is they have the grant writing tool that helps you respond to the criteria. Again, this works for others, and it could not work for other communities as well. The output you get from Tab EZ is the format isn't very compact, so you would have to reformat it, and it might not prompt you to answer all the criteria or the nuances that are kind of hidden between the lines there. So it is a good tool for those who might want to get an early start and just go through the guidelines because it shows you through what the application looks for, but don't rely on it exclusively. Now, we're still waiting for questions here. If you want, you can raise your hand, but there's another question here about working with SeeClear review. Again, we do not charge for our grant reviews. Send it to us and we will get it back to you as soon as we can. It usually takes a day or so. Sometimes in a matter of hours, we can get you your comments back. And it will be in form of a redlined document. So send them in Word format and you will get a redlined document back, as well as a scoring guidelines sheet, which points out to you where you were consistent with the guidelines and where you missed some of the points. So it's a red, yellow, green format, so it's easy to spot where you missed things out. And generally, if your score sheet has more than 3 reds, you have work to do. So we're still looking for questions here. So feel free to type anything in. Or if our panelists have any questions as well, or any added tips, maybe you can unmute yourselves and chime in. I have a question for Jeanine. Jeanine, the RFQ process where a consultant is, where a city or local government issues an RFP for a consultant to write and or implement the grant. What are the EPA guidelines on that, if any?
The only thing that I'm aware of, Ignacio, is that you cannot incur costs. You can't put that in your budget. It's an ineligible cost, but it has to be competitive, if that makes sense.
And what does competitive actually mean? Is there a minimum time for when the RFP should be out?
Well, you have to follow federal procurement requirements, and you have to make the request for proposals open to everyone. It has to be a fair competition.
Okay, we have a request here to display the site work sessions again. So these are the site sessions for the in-person EPA.
Yes, these are for our regional workshops that we're going to be conducting on the FY20 guidelines. And we expect to finalize the locations for Puerto Rico and VI very shortly. And we'll be making those announcements via email and through other medias. So hoping that we'll have some attendance from those locations as well.
And there's a question here about the slides. Yes, the slides will be made available after the webinar. So you will receive this in a day or so. Now I have a question for Kaitlin regarding working with coalition partners. What was the Land Bank's history in working with the different coalition partners? Has it always been smooth? And in the case it wasn't, how did you get things together to work on a work plan that everyone was happy with? Kaitlin, are you muted?
Sorry, I was muted.
Okay.
Ignacio, can you repeat that?
Oh, yes. In the case of coalition partners, what did you have a long history in working with your coalition partners? Have they always been smooth? And in the case that you do not completely line up in in everything you do, how you smooth things over to get to a work plan that you could all agree on?
Well, it's interesting you should ask that. We were jointly established by the city and the county And we have a good working relationship with both entities, although they always haven't had a good working relationship with each other. And so we got everybody together, and everyone did acknowledge that we stand a much better chance of success if we're working together than if we're not. And so it was just kind of an iterative process of inventorying the sites that we wanted to cover and discussing, quite frankly and openly with each other, about what would be a fair distribution of resources.
All right. Okay, thank you. I have a question here. It looks like an eligibility question for Jeanine, and perhaps anyone else can chime in. But Jeanine, I think this one is better addressed to you.
Okay.
We have 2 privately owned sites. One is in the Superfund program, and one has done some cleanup. We also have a village-owned property that has not been assessed. Can we apply for funds to address one or more of these sites?
I, as a reviewer and project officer, would recommend that that particular person or entity apply for an assessment grant to find out what's on that site in the village. I think that the site that's on a Superfund would not be eligible because it wouldn't be considered a brownfield. And is most likely someone that's responsible for the contamination. Therefore, that's why it's a Superfund site.
Yes, actually, I have a follow-up question for this, and thanks for asking that question, Elizabeth. My question is, there are some of these eligibility questions seem to vary by region. We had there was a site that was not a Superfund, but it was another enforcement site. It was under the TSCA program. And in the instance where the responsible party was willing to take on the cleanup in order to get it to the consistent with the land use, so it was a commercial site, they were going to clean it up to commercial standard. Are any additional assessments or perhaps studies eligible for EPA grants if they are proposing to clean it up to a higher standard? So for instance, Superfund, they're going to clean it up to commercial, but then the community wants to clean it up for a park or for another use which requires a stricter cleanup. Would for instance, a risk assessment be eligible for funding, or land use, community participation, that kind of activity?
Eligible under the Superfund program, not under us, I don't think.
It would be eligible, obviously, under the Superfund program. I will have to give thought to that because under the Brownfields program, it depends on who would be the owner of the grant. If it's a municipality applying on behalf of that site, it would be eligible because they didn't cause the contamination, obviously. So if it's that entity wanting to apply for funding, then that's definitely not allowed.
Yeah, so I think going back to Elizabeth's question, if the Superfund was studies they wanted to do on the Superfund site were above what the Superfund program manager required, could it potentially be, could assessment funds potentially be used for land use planning and that kind of activity?
Yes, that I think would be allowable under the grant, but that couldn't be the sole activity because remember, it's either you're applying for an assessment, a cleanup, or an RLF grant this year. So we would have to see definitely more than just that. We would definitely need to see some assessment work being done with that funding.
Thank you. We're at 11:03, and so we'll wait a couple more seconds for questions. Otherwise, we will thank you for attending. Please send us feedback on the webinar. Any follow-up questions, please contact our speakers. Going. So thank you so much for joining us. And start writing those grants early, and good luck. And please tune in to the other webinars and attend one of these workshops in person. Thanks so much and good afternoon.